Humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. I'll be your MC today. I am joining you from sunny but cold Corrales, New Mexico, bordering Albuquerque. I understand it's been snowing quite heavily in Portland in certain places, and I'll tell you, I do not miss that. Snow and I do not get along. We had a fun time in the green room this morning, talking to the speaker beforehand, and I can tell you that she is highly engaging and looks forward to your questions. A reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by arts, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. And pinch hitting today as our reader, the organizer, or as we like to call him, the Lord of the Readers, Mr. Al Christians.
Today's reading is from John Dewey, who lived from 1859 to 1952. And he was one of the major movers in the early years of the humanist movement around the time of the first Humanist Manifesto, et cetera, et cetera. John Dewey, writing about art, this is a kind of something to set the scene for our talent show in a couple of weeks. And it has to do with the timeliness of art. And I think that's apt in this group because a lot of us, drag up art from long ago. And he talks about how art and time relate here a little bit. A work of art, no matter how old and classic, is actually not just potentially a work of art only when it lives in some individualized experience. As a piece of parchment or of marble, of canvas, it remains subject to the ravages, self-identical throughout the ages. But as a work of art, it is recreated every time it is aesthetically experienced. No one doubts this fact in the rendering of a musical score. No one supposes that the lines and dots on paper are more than the recorded means of evoking the work of art. But what is true of it is equally true of the Parthenon as a building. It is absurd to ask what an artist really meant by his product. He himself would find different meanings in it at different days and hours and in different stages of his own development. If he could be articulate, he would say, I meant just that. And that means whatever you or anyone else can honestly, that is in virtue of your own vital experience, get out of it. Any other idea makes the boasted universality of the work of art a synonym for monotonous identity. The Parthenon or whatever is universal because it can continuously inspire new personal realizations and experience. It is simply the impossibility that anyone today should experience the Parthenon as the devout Athenian contemporary citizen experienced it, any more than the religious statuary of the 12th century can mean aesthetically, even to a good Catholic today, just what it meant to the worshipers of the old period. The works that fail to become new are not those which are universal, but those which are dated. The enduring art product may have been and probably was called forth by something occasional, something having its own date and place. But what was evoked is a substance so formed that it can enter into the experiences of others and enable them to have more intense and more fully rounded out experiences of their own. This is what it is to have form.
Thank you, Al. An excellent reading with a quality visual of the trees covered with snow out your window there. We live in the age of plastics. Plastic pollution has exploded into a global crisis that threatens our environments and our health. This morning, we explore how we got here and how plastics affect our planet. We will discuss potential solutions to reverse this course and stop the crisis. Dr. Anja Malawi Brandon is the U.S. Plastics Policy Analyst at the Ocean Conservancy. She holds a Ph.D. in environmental engineering and Science from Stanford University. Let's have a warm yet muted HTP welcome for Anja Malawi Brandon.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. David, would you give me, perfect. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you guys again for having me. I'm going to try to keep this relatively short and sweet to leave plenty of time for questions at the end, because I always find that the most engaging, and I know this is a incredibly complicated and huge subject, and there's lots of questions to be had. So kicking it off, plastic pollution. I feel like at this point, we're all relatively used to images like this. We know plastic is in our oceans, in our waterways, we see it on our beaches, and most people would start a presentation about plastic pollution off with an image like this. But I actually want to take one step back from there and just acknowledge that plastics have been an incredibly useful material. Right now, more than ever, probably, we are all highly aware of that in terms of personal protective equipment, all the plastic used in our COVID testing and vaccines, and then just generally medical equipment highly reliant on plastic. So plastics are incredibly, incredibly useful. They were a revolutionary material. And if we think about why, they're strong, they're durable. Importantly, for a lot of these medical applications, they're incredibly inert, so they don't react with our body necessarily. They're very easy to manufacture, and they're incredibly cheap. We'll talk a little bit about why in a second here. But all of these things, really, once we figured out how to make plastics, we were off to the races using it pretty much everywhere. However, we know that a lot of these same principles, strong, durable, inert, make it really hard for plastics to break down in our environment. So they are, generally speaking, recalcitrant, meaning that once they escape into the environment, they may photodegrade or break down into smaller pieces, which again, we'll talk about more in a second here. But they don't really go away. And that's because they are not a natural material. These are an entirely man-made material. So what exactly are plastics? Plastic, the word, it comes from both Latin and Greek, meaning easily shaped or molded, capable of being molded into various forms. So as you see here, once we figured out plastics, again, we kind of used it everywhere. So it takes any number of shapes and forms throughout our marketplace. They are all a polymer, which is just a long chain of repeating units, kind of shown here by this little beaded necklace. So it's made up of the same piece over and over again into a long polymer. In the case of plastics, the minimum unit, so a monomer, is some form of hydrocarbon. So it could be C's and H's like we see here. It could be a styrene, as in making polystyrene. Whatever it is, it's mostly just carbons and hydrogens strung together to make this long repeating unit. As I mentioned, they are a hydrocarbon, so just carbons and hydrogens. There's a few differences here and there with most types of plastics. And hydrocarbons are essentially oils. So these are a fossil fuel product. So we get fossil fuel from the ground. We run it through a series of distillations and high temperature, high heat, get out various products, including things like gasoline. And one of these products is naphtha, which goes into making all of our plastics. And as we've already mentioned, they do not readily biodegrade. So these are extraordinarily long polymers that most things just can't even access if they wanted to biodegrade. So thinking about how most things break down in the environment naturally, there's bacteria, there's fungi, there's all sorts of other things that are kind of trained up to break things down, and they have been for millennia. And this is an entirely new thing that these bacteria and fungi don't know what the heck to do with. So they do not readily break down in our environment. As we kind of alluded to in my talk abstract, this time period is essentially called the age of plastics. So plastics were invented back in the early, 1904-ish, by Dr. Leo Baekeland, who created Bakelite, which was the first real, man-made polymer. But we didn't really take off until post-World War II. And that was a lot about the availability of resources, but also just the amount of fossil fuels we were extracting. So after World War II, when we had more money, more access to resources, we really see plastics absolutely take off. And some of the increase in this plastic production has gone to some of the incredibly useful things I told you about, medical applications, preventing food waste, things like that. The vast majority of this increase has gone to single-use packaging, with the idea, this was actively sold to us at the time as disposable and convenience. So there were ads about how you'll never have to clean a dish again because you can just use plastic and then throw it away, right? This seemed groundbreaking and historic, and a major increase in convenience. However, we now know that there really is no away and throw away. So we are left with this rampant accumulation of plastics. In this figure here, I'm just showing kind of a couple different scenarios. If you extrapolate out how much plastic we're making today. So you have a worst case in which we continue on this exponential growth in plastics, which is just kind of horrifying looking. Or you have a linear growth based on the last couple of decades, which is more likely and still horrifying, even if we go down that path. So in many ways, this reminds me of a lot of our climate change discussions with the hockey stick graph, and things just rampant increase at the end. And it's pretty mind-boggling to figure out how you not only stop that trend, but also reverse it. So we certainly have our work cut out for us. Just to give a little bit more context here, about half of all of the plastics ever made have been manufactured in the last 15 years. So that just kind of shows you the exponential path we have been on. Now, the real problem with plastics, which I've alluded to at this point, is that we are very linear in process. So we make them, we use them, we throw them away. So we get this linear life cycle of make, use, discard. And this linear path is what ends up leading to plastics accumulating either in landfills, recycling, or at worst case in our environment. And that's where we lead to these problems that we're all so familiar with now of plastics impacting our natural ecosystem, right? So whether it's our charismatic macrofauna, like a whale or an albatross, and these horrible images of ingesting plastics, or it's some of our more charismatic microfauna, like the zooplankton that you see down here at the bottom, who have ingested fluorescent plastics. These zooplankton make up the bottom of the marine food web, so probably not a great sign that they are also eating plastics. Just to add just some numbers to this discussion, if we look at the scale of the crisis, its recent estimates put it at about 11 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean each year globally. So this is kind of from throughout the country, throughout the world. This figure here is from the Ocean Conservancy's International Coastal Cleanup in 2020. And this just looks at, by the numbers, how much trash was picked up, what were the top 10 items, things like that. One thing to keep in mind, 2020, there was this little pandemic happening. I don't know if you all heard about it. So we actually only had 200,000 participants rather than the 1 million plus. And they still collected over 5 million pounds of trash. So this is actually a very low number for us compared to other years. Interestingly, they looked at this data for the last 35 years that this cleanup has been happening, and almost 70% of the items collected could not have been recycled. So there really, other than landfilling, was not a better case scenario for a lot of those that garbage. And we'll talk about that more in a second here. 6 of the top 10 items in the most commonly discovered list are single-use plastics. There's a few other items there like cigarette butts, which just historically remain kind of the #1 item collected on beaches. And then, a few other things like beverage cans, which are aluminum, but 6 of the top 10 are these single-use plastics that we're talking about. And then just to bring it home here in Oregon, where I'm based, about almost 2,000 pounds of trash were cleaned up by 400 people. And that's just during our international coastal cleanups, really one day. So a lot of pretty terrifying numbers there. Putting this into the context of other discussions that we're having right now about the environment writ large, plastics very much are a climate and environmental justice crisis as well. They've kind of been seen as this separate issue of affecting our marine life and, save the turtles and all of that, which is hugely, hugely important. They are absolutely threatening and endangering marine life. However, they're doing much more than that. So greenhouse gas emissions from the plastics sector are equivalent to 370 million passenger cars. So that's huge. We really cannot solve our climate crisis without addressing this plastics issue. In the next 30 years, plastic production is expected to triple and account for nearly 20% of all oil consumed. That is in no small part because fossil fuel industry and the companies responsible for that look at what's happening in the world and say, okay, everyone's going to EV cars. We need something else to deal with all of this oil and fossil fuel, and are actively pushing single-use plastics. They're throwing their weight behind single-use plastics because that is the only outlet they have for profit really moving forward. And these facilities that manufacture plastic, as well as some of the facilities that deal with our plastic waste, are disproportionately located in low-income and minority communities and have a disproportionate impact on their health. So really perpetuating a lot of the historic environmental injustice we've seen in these communities. And as I alluded to, this is kind of how we actually get to the problem where we have our make, use, dispose. Before that, even upstream, this is where our climate connection comes in. We extract fossil fuels, we run them through this big cracker, and this third item here that you see, naphtha, goes into all of our plastic production. So really just, if you take away nothing, plastics are just a solidified form of fossil fuels. And I think that is something that it is convenient to not think about sometimes. A little bit more on the plastic pollution crisis kind of in general. We truly know that at this point, there's been enough research done that plastic pollution is ubiquitous in our environment. Plastics have been found in 60% of all seabird species globally, and 100% of all sea turtle species. So this is very much impacting our natural biodiversity and natural ecosystems in ways that we will probably never be able to fully comprehend. Moreover, entanglement is kind of a key issue when it comes to plastics. This was really like the first issue that people thought about when it came to plastic pollutions. We have ghost gear, so old fishing lines and things like that that are thrown off boats, 6-pack beverage rings, things like that that are kind of classically seen as entangling our marine mammals and other species. So about 45% of all of our internationally listed marine mammals, so those are protected marine mammal species, have been affected by some of this entanglement through ghost gear. And there's kind of I'm going to talk a lot more about plastic pollution today and single-use plastics and things like that. But at Ocean Conservancy, I know many other places, there's a whole separate effort just kind of figuring out how we manage that ghost gear problem specifically. In terms of some other just like emerging concerns in the plastic space, one thing we hear a lot about right now is microplastics. It's been estimated that nearly 3 million metric tons of microplastics flow into our ocean annually, not even calculating the amount of microplastics that are generated in the ocean. So plastics, as I mentioned, do not biodegrade, they do not break down and go away. However, we've all seen a Coke bottle or another bottle kind of left out in the sun too long, it gets brittle and can break down, like it breaks up, into a bunch of smaller pieces. So, we can understand how some of these plastic products we're using kind of break up into these small pieces. Interestingly, in terms of the microplastic space, major contributors are actually tire dust from roads. So car tires, this was not even on my radar until this last year, but car tires are made out of rubber. This rubber is designed to wear down for the safety of our driving. And when it wears down, all those little rubber particles go into whatever storm water or water runoff comes off of our roads. So, we all see those collection or storm drains on our roads. They kind of slowly erode, go down there, and a lot of those get pumped right into whatever adjacent waterways we have. This was a really big issue earlier this year. I don't know if many of you saw it. There was a really awesome article in the New York Times that I'm happy to share afterwards on a really interesting research study conducted by the University of Washington along with some collaborators that linked these tire dust particles, and in particular one specific chemical that is used in tire manufacturing, to a lot of the death of urban salmon. So salmon that come back up the river to spawn and are kind of in more urban adjacent areas, so farther inland. These tire dust particles carry with them a chemical that is essentially lethal to coho salmon at the right concentration. And so it's a huge problem, especially for an endangered species like some of our salmon species in the Pacific Northwest. The other one of the other big contributors to microplastics are plastic pellets. So in the creation of a plastic bottle, they first make these little pellets that are called nurdles. So it's just raw plastic resin. It gets manufactured as a nurdle in one place and then typically driven, trained, shipped somewhere else to be turned into an actual plastic product. Those plastic pellets are small and hard to contain and flow out of the production facility, the transportation system, and make up a pretty significant contributor to microplastic pollution. And the last one is a little bit surprising, but it's actually microfibers from all of the clothes we wear. Polyester is another type of plastic, and it's a synthetic material. A lot of clothes have some amount of polyester in it at this point because it's incredibly durable, easy to use, easy to work with. And just like our natural textiles and fibers, they all kind of shed as they get washed. And these microfibers are pretty easy to, they're so small that they kind of escape into our waterways from our municipal wastewater. Our municipal wastewater systems are not really designed to handle these types of small particles. They're kind of designed to handle pathogens specifically. So we just have this huge other issue that our systems were never designed to handle. So we have a lot of those flowing into our waterways. And so, we have any number of these issues. And I think sometimes it's hard to imagine like, okay, great, this is like a huge issue, this is overwhelming. What does it matter? what is it? How does it relate to me? That's maybe not a question this group is asking. You guys are invited me here, so you clearly care about this. But just in case you needed any convincing, these microplastics in particular have a questionable impact on human health at this point. So there's a lot of research ongoing and still needed, but we know that microplastics have been detected in the human body. A few of the more alarming research papers I've seen recently have found microplastics on the maternal and fetal side of a placenta, which suggests that these microplastics not only make it into our body, but they are then transported through our blood system. Moreover, they've done some fecal analysis looking at what's coming out of us in terms of how many microplastics we've ingested, and infants have a 14 times higher rate of microplastics in their feces than adults. And one of the hypotheses as the major drivers there is all of the plastic bottles that infants use, which we now know shed an incredible amount of microfibers. And it's a new source of potential harm to infants, whereas we all used to use glass bottle because that's what we had available, and now it's so convenient you don't have to worry about glass breaking, but it does come with some of these other potential concerns. Studies have also suggested that these microplastics, they're a foreign object in our body, so in many ways they act similarly to a virus in terms of what it causes locally in terms of cell death and cell damage. So they are linked to inflammation and oxidative stress and kind of localized tissue damage. And one thing they're looking at right now, which I find just very interesting, is the actual shape of these microplastics are kind of linked to how much damage they do in the cell. So a spherical microplastic is probably less harmful because your body knows how to handle and can encapsulate spheres and handle those types of things with some of our immune response. However, these kind of more irregularly shaped microplastics seem to be causing more harm. And in adults, we're not drinking out of baby bottles. So how are we potentially getting exposed to these microplastics? Well, seafood is hypothesized to be a major driver, and there's actually some interesting research that will be coming out of Ocean Conservancy in the next year, looking at rates of microplastics in seafood and what that might contribute to human exposure. We do drink out of water bottles, which are known to have some leakage. We also have some evidence that that microplastics are just found in our drinking water. Again, our drinking water systems are wonderful at what they do, and they were never designed to do this. So we are now putting stresses on these normal municipal systems we have. Table salt, perhaps not surprisingly, is also a source. Depending on how you're making table salt and where you get it from, you often are dehydrating salt from the ocean. So you put a bunch of water in a flat, let the water evaporate and collect the salt and mill it afterwards. And you can imagine if there's a bunch of microplastics in the ocean, you are then going to get microplastics in table salt. So a bit worrisome there. Not to add insult to injury, I swear I will get to some good news by the end of this. I do see some worried faces here. We know that plastics contain chemical additives. These are plasticizers that can help with the manufacturing, stabilizers that help with durability, photo stabilizers that help them keep color looking good, any sort of plastic or any sort of number of chemicals like that. So interestingly, in that tire dust example, the chemical was a stabilizer that kind of helps keep tires from breaking down when they're exposed to ozone, because we know that cars generate trace amounts of ozone. So you don't want that ozone interacting with your tires, so you put this chemical in to interact with that ozone instead. Worryingly, most of these chemicals are not chemically bound to the plastic, So if we go back to our image of this plastic as this long polymer of repeating units, these chemicals are added in the manufacturing process, but not chemically attached, which means under the right circumstances, they are free to be released from the plastic. As I mentioned with the tire dust again, that chemical obviously leaches out. And we do have evidence that under the right circumstances, these things can leach out from the plastics we are using. And there's certainly human health impacts associated with these chemicals. The amount and severity and all of those things are still being quantified. So endocrine disruption is something we've obviously all heard about, as well as like other hormonal issues that come with plastics. Neurotoxicity and even things like cancer are of concern when it comes to these chemicals that we are being exposed to. So clearly our status quo isn't working. So this just kind of shows what's really happening with all of our plastic waste. So this is a few years outdated, and I actually stole this from Senator Udall, the former senator from New Mexico, who was a real champion on plastics issues. In the US, so this is a couple of years ago, we generated 35 million tons of plastic waste. Right off the bat, about 75% of that just goes to a landfill. Never even had another option. Another 15% goes to incinerators, where it is burned and potentially releases harmful chemicals through that exposure pathway, especially if there are not good regulatory controls. Those incinerators, importantly, are like about 80% of them in the United States are located in what the Biden administration classifies as environmental justice communities. So clearly they are not great, otherwise we would have put them everywhere, and instead we put them in low income and majority minority communities. Of the plastics that do get sorted for recycling, 8.5%, almost 9%, depending on the year. Historically, a bunch of that got shipped overseas because we didn't have the infrastructure to handle it. So we would ship it overseas to China. China has subsequently stopped accepting our plastic waste scrap. So instead of pivoting and trying to manage our waste as well, we have taken to shipping it overseas to Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. So we are working on that. We had export less waste than we used to, but we still are a major exporter. Of that recycling, about 30% goes to being recycled here, and you see, about 2.5% of all of that waste that's collected ends up getting recycled. So just digging into this recycling element a little bit more, we have been told reduce, reuse, recycle. What is wrong? We were told that was how to fix this issue. There's any number of ads that have existed out there. Don't be a litter bug, make sure you're recycling, all of those things. And if we just look at our recycling system, it was never really designed to work. Most places, if you have recycling, which I guess I'll just jump off the bat and say only 54% of American households have automatic access to convenient recycling. So here in Portland, Oregon, I get my recycling picked up on Thursdays every week. I pay for that, but it was automatic. One of the services I was eligible for. Our rural communities, different states do not have that. There are instead sometimes dumping zones for recycling or drop-off centers. I don't know about you, if I had to do that, maybe I would start up strong on a pretty rainy day. Maybe I don't do that as much. Maybe I just put it in the landfill. So access is a huge issue. For those of us who do have access to recycling, we have what's called a mixed waste stream. So all of these things go into our blue bin here. Portland, the exception, tends to be glass. We have a separate glass stream. But like within paper, all of those cardboard, everything, and all of these different plastics. I'm sure we're all very familiar with these little numbers. If you ever looked at the bottom of a bottle, these are called resin codes. They just represent different types of plastics. And they're all surrounded by this little reduce, reuse, recycling chasing arrows, as we call it. Interestingly, I'll just jump ahead. Number 4 through 7 are essentially not recyclable anywhere. So they have this chasing arrow symbols that we all associate with our recycling system. They're right on the product. You look at it and you say, hey, it has a must be recyclable. No one wants that. So they get sorted out. But the fact that we have it on there means that a lot of people put it into our recycling system and we get all sorts of contamination within the recycling stream, which leads to lower quality recycled content coming out, higher cost in terms of sorting and things like that in the recycling centers. And really this lack of standardization and design of products as well as labeling leads to all sorts of consumer confusion and also confusion for the recycling systems. There's not a universal code for how you can label a water bottle. And if there's like just really small no-brainer things. If you have a water bottle label that covers the entire thing of the plastic, a sorter can't read it. So that bottle just gets shoved off to landfill instead of recycled, all because we have these really small design things that we could fix and address. But we never have because we kind of let the market design whatever the heck it wants. And of course, those chemical additives we just talked about also limit what we can do with our recycled content. So if we have a bunch of chemical additives used in some products, the recycled content we get out still has a lot of those additives. And I don't know about you, but I don't want those back in food grade products. So that's very limited in terms of how we can recycle plastic packaging back into plastic packaging for food. And just one last thing before we start talking about solutions, and I promise I'll get there and leave time for questions. The stopping plastic pollution really does start with us. I think historically there's been some evidence that suggests that high income countries, we manage our plastic waste. Yes, we make a lot, but we're not a major contributor to plastic pollution. And this paper came out last year by Cara Lavender-Law, as well as some Ocean Conservancy co-authors, and it quantified how much, it really tracked the waste that we export abroad and have historically, and how much of that contributes to our ocean plastic pollution problem. And when you kind of do that math on the back end, we are ranked as high as 3rd for major contributors to ocean-bound plastic. So we are essentially the top 3 country in terms of polluting our ocean with plastic. So really what we do here matters, both in terms of directly cutting off the source of plastics into the ocean, and because we are just a huge market for plastics. So kind of what goes here kind of goes internationally. So big picture, we have all this plastic flowing into our ocean, our seafood, our food, our table salt, baby bottles. How do we stop this? So we really need to look upstream at what we're doing with our plastics in the first place to prevent this issue. Yes, it's great to put litter traps out there. Yes, it's great to do beach cleanups. We need all of those things, but we also need to make less plastic in the first place. And we also need to reuse more. We need to fix our recycling system so that it's doing what we want it to. And this is very much a yes and situation. We need to do a range of solutions as diverse as this crisis that we are facing. This is unfortunately not something that's going to be solved by a silver bullet, which is really challenging, because that means we will implement 5 different solutions and see a 10% increase in or decrease in plastic going into the ocean. And that's great, and we need that. And we also need steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it's really hard to see progress because we need so many different solutions. And ultimately, we have the tools that we need to do this. We know how to stop this problem. So if we think about this really linear life cycle, we have any number of interventions we can take to kind of reform our system. So we can start by standardizing our recycling to kind of help fix this tiny fraction of recycling. There's a lot of, Oregon just passed one, California, there's a lot of these truth in labeling laws coming out now that says, if you're going to label something as recyclable, it better damn well be recyclable. So, you know, kind of better consumer information so that consumers are empowered to be part of the solution should they choose to be. We also need to fix the access to recycling. We cannot collect all the plastic we need to actually recycle and reuse if only 54% of the country can recycle in the first place. More generally, we need to hold producers of these plastic products responsible for their waste. This is a very similar issue as we see in the climate space again. We have externalized all of the cost of these environmental impacts and waste management. So the major plastic producers get really cheap fossil fuels, produce whatever they want, and then they get to wipe their hands of the situation. Whereas if they had to internalize some of the costs for managing their plastic waste, maybe they would design easier to recycle products. Maybe they would use less packaging in the first place. And we have legislative tools to start implementing some of those. So the first is extended producer responsibility, which is just a fancy way of saying you plastic producers are now going to be financially responsible for helping us manage your plastic waste. Oregon just became one of the first two states in the nation to pass a form of extended producer responsibility. So Oregon and Maine both have that now, and will be coming online probably in the next couple of years. There's also things as simple as bottle bills, which Oregon had the first in the nation and one of the best in the nation. That's a form of this extended producer responsibility because it puts the onus on bottle makers. You know, the onus is on the consumer to return the bottle and you get your money back. But the bottle makers have to help finance that like back end system, and already that kind of has them, makes them a vested player and have a vested interest in making sure that system works. In terms of what we use, we can support reuse and refill models. We used to have glass milk cartons or milk jugs that we would put out and get refilled. Like that is a system that has gone away, but we could move to that type of system again. It just takes a concerted effort and people saying, yes, we want that. And we can also just do some of the really basics of eliminating unnecessary packaging and some of these most problematic materials that contribute to contamination in our recycling stream. A lot of states have done already, you know, eliminating plastic carryout bags, eliminating polystyrene foam products that can't be recycled. You know, maybe when you go to Costco, you don't need individually wrapped cucumbers that are then wrapped all together, right? There's any number of these packaging products that we can scale back. And if we just think more critically, what do we really need? What does help us reduce food waste? And then just doing the bare minimum there and then moving forward, we can use a lot less plastic. Legislators are waking up and taking action. Oregon just passed the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. So that has that truth and labeling component. It has an EPR component. It's going to help with standardizing recycling. So Oregon is really leading the nation here. This hexagonal map of the country shows the states that have passed bag bans on carryout bags, whether they have fees, straight bans. You'll also see that any number of states have preemptions, which ban potential bans. So we still have our work cut out for us. And obviously, places are taking action, but we need just so much more. And the last thing I'll point to here is the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. This is the first federal bill introduced that would include a national extended producer responsibility, a national bottle bill, bans exporting our waste to other countries, bans any number of unnecessary and problematic materials. And it's really the most comprehensive bill to address plastic pollution. I'm obviously very biased. I helped write that bill in my last role while working in the Senate, but it is really a wonderful piece of legislation that unfortunately has little to no chance of passing right now in our current Senate, but is really helping change the conversation about a lot of this issue. And all of these tools will just really help us get to where we need to go. And so I just wanted to present you all with kind of the vision of where we can go with this, which is a sustainable, circular, and just economy. So, instead of this make, use, dispose, we, just use less plastics. That make becomes a lot smaller. We're using reuse and refill. We're reusing the plastics we already have to make new plastics. So we're not getting waste or extraneous products needed. In reusing the same plastics, so in actually recycling our polymers, we're going to eventually eliminate the need for virgin plastic, which is essentially fossil fuel. So we are going to help address the climate crisis. And we also need in this transition, we'll just need to be thoughtful and conscious of making sure we have a just and equitable access to these sustainable products. So right now, in Portland, a high-income individual has access to bulk product buying. You can elect to pay more for products that don't have certain types of plastic. You can elect to pay for silicone reusable bags rather than Ziploc bags, things like that. But those all have a additional price that we also have to be aware of, that not everyone has access to and yet can pay for. And so in just thinking about this, handling our plastic waste is just crucial in making sure we have a just transition as well. And I will stop here and answer questions. On this slide, we have a few resources if you want to help join this fight, either through Ocean Conservancy or just contacting me and learning more about how you can get involved or just staying informed. And I will stop here.
Dr. Brandon, that was a very thorough, understandable, and sufficiently scary presentation. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We have a number of questions coming in.
Great.
We will start with our member that is furthest from Portland, Oregon. Joining us from India this evening is Ranga.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving us a very precise figures of various aspects of the plastic one. It was revealing that the recycling, it will probably play only a very minor role in stopping the microplastic going into ocean and so on. But on the other hand, you also said that of the collected plastics, only a small fraction is recycled and reused, and most of it goes for landfill. Now, I was wondering whether, well, some of it is because they either is too expensive to reuse it, or some of them cannot be made into usable plastics directly. I was wondering whether it is possible, for example, to take those plastics just to melt them and make into big solid blocks, which can be stored, and maybe in future technology may find ways of using them, or maybe some ways to make new products out of that. How feasible is that? Is that a possible thing?
Great question. So there are a couple alternative or innovative ways to use plastic products. We have seen people turning plastics into blocks for building, using it in road construction, things like that. These are certainly innovative. I think they may help at the margins, but I think systemically we just need to really address a recycling system, because just by volume, that will get us where we need to go. This does raise another interesting point. So something that I didn't discuss that is likely to come up in more conversations in the near future in context of plastics is the issue of chemical or advanced recycling, which sounds wonderful. I would love some advanced recycling. Who wouldn't? Unfortunately, most of these advanced or chemical recycling technologies are slightly better than incineration. So there are other ways to turn plastic into energy. So they're essentially waste to energy processes. And several of the major plastic resin producers are very strategically and unfortunately doing a very good job pushing legislation to get that called recycling, which is wonderful for them, because once you burn that plastic, you have to come running back to the plastic resin producer to get more virgin plastic. So that's what they want out of it. It is great in that it does help, it doesn't mean our plastic has to go into the landfill, but it's not getting us into a circular economy in any way, shape, or form. And so that's kind of the crisis there. I think there will be new innovative technologies coming online. I worked for my PhD, I studied bacteria that actually can break down plastics. It's a little ways out, obviously, from being scalable, but there is that type of innovation coming. We're just not there just yet.
And another thing is, at the end of the day, the major solution, we should be prepared to pay more for these things, because if you want to get it cheap, naturally, you will have to spread it out.
Absolutely. I think we need to recognize that products will cost more if you internalize the environmental impacts. We also should just make producers pay a heck of a lot more, because they've gotten a free ride for 50 to 60 years now.
Our next question comes from David Beam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
You got that.
See you there. Yeah, I read a few articles in the recent past about all this, and I really caution myself never to get into conspiracies, but you've kind of alluded to this all in pretty much confirming the conspiracies about the whole oil company things. I mean, they're saying pretty much they everything they do on recycling is just a PR stunt by them. They were actively into the whole recycling thing. They knew from the very start that it would never work. It was going to be just a total fracasso. But they did it anyways, again, as a PR stunt. And of course, as you talked about, I mean, it's a big revenue stream for them, and it's one that's growing, and it's probably especially important now because that's a revenue stream that's growing versus their fuel thing that's actually going down. So it's even more of an important part of their bottom line than ever before. So I think you pretty much said that they haven't been much of a friend to this whole thing. So I'm just curious about, if you could talk a little more about, how hard they pushed against this and what kind of things they've done to push against, the whole recycling of plastics and making it easy and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few nuances there before getting into a little bit more of your question. I think that there's layers within industry, and there's different types of industry. So the consumer brands that we are all familiar with, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, blah, 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 would love to be sustainable, right? It is a reputational PR risk for them that their plastics end up in rivers, end up in the ocean. So they have this every bottle back campaign. They genuinely want to get every bottle back and recycle it. They don't want to pay for it, but they would love to get that. The other side of that is absolutely correct. The oil companies, these people who are producing virgin plastic out of fossil fuels. I would say it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just economics. They have a bottom line, they're trying to make money. Unfortunately, they make their money off exploiting natural resources, and that is inherently unsustainable. So because they have a bottom line, they fight really hard. Recently, there was a really exciting bill introduced in the Senate by a senator from Rhode Island, Senator Whitehouse, to place a tax on virgin plastic that goes into using single-use products. So, one way of incentivizing behavior is saying, hey, you're doing a bad thing, I'm going to tax it. You're going to stop, you're going to do less of that bad thing. So just really trying to hit them where it hurts economically to say, you need to internalize these costs. So it put a 10-cent and then a 20-cent fee per, I feel like kilogram, I could look it back up, but a decent fee on these products. The industry ran, I believe, a $1 to $7 million campaign against it, largely just focused in DC. So I'm sure we didn't really see ads here, but they took out full page ads in the Washington Post in the DC area to talk about how this would, impact the plastics that you get in your bicycle helmet and things like that. Really trying to make the pitch that this would hurt all these other resources that we need, whereas really this bill was very targeted at single-use plastics only. So they are going to keep pushing back. I would expect nothing less. This is very much part of their bottom line. They're being hit hard on the climate front. We're going to hit them hard on the plastics front. And we're just going to have to keep doing that and hope that our legislators listen to the people.
Suzanne has had her question, her hand up for quite a while. Suzanne, come on in and ask your question.
Thanks. Thank you, Anja, for doing the work. And my question is about one of our environmental groups have negotiated with Trader Joe's. I heard this about 3 years ago, and Trader Joe's was committing to changing their packaging. We know how heavily involved they are with plastic because it keeps the food looking good and people like it, they think it's so neat and tidy. So can you tell me, is that true? And where is Trader Joe's in their commitment?
I unfortunately don't know details about that commitment specifically. I do know that there's a lot of companies, industries, stores that are trying to do the right thing. And I think no small part of that is because we, the public, are fed up by them not doing the right thing. And so, Trader Joe's, if they want to keep getting customers from maybe a more leftist leaning clientele that they are accustomed to, they need to do the right thing on the environment. And I'm not surprised that they tried to work with groups to do that. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of these groups right now don't have options in terms of where to turn to both prevent food waste and reduce packaging. So obviously reuse and refill is going to be the way of the future. I think that's going to play a huge part. COVID set that back a while. We now know that there's little to no transmission via contact or food contact, but understandably the public was really scared. And so, all of the bulk access things that we did have went away, and many of them have not come back yet. We also just need a lot of innovation and work in alternative materials to present other options for plastic that are both, degradable and also have less of a climate impact.
We have a question from one of our newest members, Mr. Paul Gibbons. Paul.
Hey, Dr. Brandon. So thanks a lot for your talks. Really fantastic to hear all that. First of all, also just thank you for all the work you've been doing this. It's great to see, really smart and driven people like yourself working in this. I had a question about, as a scientist, it must be, I assume it's, or I think it's probably very frustrating for you to work on this and get so much data and so much very clear, it's not it's not gray area to you. It's like, we know these are problem stuff, but data itself doesn't seem to like change user behaviors. So I'm trying to think in the framework of, you know, consumers versus the legislature versus, you know, the big conglomerates like P&G, Nestle, Kraft, Coca-Cola, all those. Going forward, do you, you know, I'm thinking specifically of, you talked about the legislation that failed in the Senate or things like that. Going forward, how do you, and I assume it's all, but would you say consumer driven, or, you know, it's, I think politicians won't act if their constituents don't push hard enough, and the brands, you know, care about their consumers, but then also the brands can just be told what to do by design. It's this weird triangle. Where do you see the really big like anchor that's slowing this down? Is it our legislature, or is it the brands, or is it the consumers that are failing most, or really not failing, but actively pushing back and stopping it, I would say?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think there's not a one obvious answer. You're right. It's kind of this like self-fulfilling challenge where it's all, you know, feedback loops all kind of throughout. You know, I think moving forward, I can just tell you kind of my theory of change and where I see things going, perhaps rather than the like big issues. I think consumers don't necessarily know how broken our system is. I think it's going to be very important that we say to people, you're paying for recycling, 85% of that is going to the landfill. It's like, we as most people want to do the right thing and assume we are doing the right thing when we're recycling. And I think it's going to be incredibly eye-opening when people learn that they are not. We have seen time and time again that consumers and really people power drive some of these initial changes. So straw bans, bag bans, things like that. So I think that general awakening is going to be really huge and helpful. And this does need to be something that legislatures and consumers or brands are hearing from consumers. On the kind of legislative front, hearing from constituents is huge and always important. I think there also just needs to be a little bit, well, we need to elect more progressive members. That caveat aside, I think connecting this to some of the other crises that we are facing is going to be really important and helpful. Like, I think right now, a lot of things in state houses and in federal legislation is like, guys, we can't do everything. We need to focus on climate, or we need to focus on this. And just kind of that recognition that this is an issue that does connect to human health. And like, if you want to keep people healthy, you need to address this. It connects to climate. If you want to address the climate crisis, you need to address this. It connects to environmental justice. You know, President Biden says we want to invest in environmental justice communities. Great, you need to sort of like regulate and legislate around this as well. So I do think there's a little bit of like all pushback there. On the brands front in particular, there are a lot of places that are trying to like do better. I think they see a lot of pushback from consumers and want to be on the right side of this. They, I think, will ultimately need a legislative push. And it's, you know, they are publicly traded. It's really hard for them to justify making like huge cost impacts. So we need, you know, federal investment in some of these alternatives so that they can be more cost effective. But we also just need to regulate them and say like, hey, this is what's going to happen. Now you can go forth and do these things that you might have wanted to do without it being a risk to, you know, your stakeholders or your, you know, stockholders more specifically, I guess.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I'll read a question from Willie. In addition to polyester, what are some of the other fabrics that contain plastics?
That's a great question. I think, you know, polyester is kind of like the catch-all term for a lot of those like fabric and plastic textiles. Polyamides are sometimes used. Nylon is a plastic. Trying to think of other textile terms.
How about Orlon and rayon and spandex?
Yep.
All those synthetic ones, do they have plastic in them?
If they're synthetic, they're plastic.
So all we can wear is wool and cotton and silk and bamboo.
If you want to avoid plastics, yes. Those natural fibers also shed. And at this point, a lot of those natural fibers have been processed with chemical additives as well. So when they shed chemicals as well.
Oh, no.
Yes. I frequently find myself as the bearer of bad news. However, there are, you know, we need to work on upstream options for that. So there are like a lot of, especially like the sportswear groups that do use a lot of synthetic fibers, like your Nikes, your Adidas, things like that.
Spandex, yeah.
Yeah, they're all coming together and talking about like what you can do upstream. But there's also a lot of stuff we can do downstream. And unfortunately, that's kind of the only options we have
You
for
mean
that
like
right now.
throwing it, you're talking about throwing it away?
I'm talking about machine washing filtration units. So there's, you know, little in-unit kind of microfiber collection balls. I can certainly send out resources to this afterwards.
Oh.
Collect some of the microfibers that you shed. We could also regulate and legislate that all new manufactured washing machines have to have a microfiber trap in production. It's along the lines of what we did with like Energy Star appliances. We can just say, hey, like this is an environmental problem. We just need to, like, any new machine coming online in 2025, you put in a microfiber trap, and then you can give people a rebate if they trade in. So kind of very similar to what we did with Energy Star appliances. And then we can also work with federal dollars at like the municipal level. So we all have wastewater treatment plants. Again, they were all designed to get rid of carbon and pathogens, not to get rid of plastics. And so we can go back, and if there's enough money, renovate to make sure that they're not becoming a major contributor to our plastic problem.
Well, score one for the nudist colonies. It doesn't seem like we have much in the way of floating options there. We have a question from our technical producer and president, Mr. David Danucci.
Thanks. Thank you very much for this. A few comments I wanted to make. One was you had this picture of the whale with all the garbage coming out of his mouth, and I wanted to make clear that that's an artistic installation. That entire whale is built of garbage plastic. I did want to also comment on the, I often pick up stuff from the deli at Fred Meyer, and it comes in little plastic containers. And I've even asked them, you know, is there any way for me to like bring my own containers? And they kind of like, what are you asking? And kind of asked around and said, no, we can't really do that, but maybe someday. So it sounded like maybe they would look into it. I wanted to kind of add on a little bit to a question that somebody else asked, and that is the whole thing about plastic recycling sounds like it has in the past, at least, been driven almost completely by the oil industry trying to make it look like that was a solution to something, even though it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And one of my questions is, you know, whether or not the whole idea of plastic recycling was created by them, and it's not realistic at all. Maybe, you know, we should even give up on this idea because it was just kind of introduced by them, and we should just acknowledge that and move on. And the other part is, so apparently, you know, I watched this video by Sabina Hassenfelter, who went into some things about plastics and how dangerous they are and whatever. And she kind of made this analogy with plastics and lignins. I mean, for 300 million years, we had trees creating lignins and no way to break them down. And now we have plastics that's kind of filling the same kind of role, but we don't want to wait for, you know, 300 million years for some form of nature to come along and find a way to break them down. And as you mentioned, you know, there are some forms now that are trying to find ways to biodegrade them. But if we biodegrade them, isn't that basically going to turn them into hydrocarbons that's just going to like cause, I mean, that goes into the whole global warming or whatever stuff there. So, and there are some places where we want plastics to last a long, long time, where they're protecting things or whatever, and we don't want them to break down. Yeah, I'll just leave it there and see what you have to say about those.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you are accurately hitting the nail on the head. This is a super duper complicated issue, and there's really not a right answer. I guess maybe in reverse order, or going back into your order, on recycling, I don't think it was industry did not create recycling, but they have been a major contributor in putting the burden on consumers. So whether that was the incredibly problematic and racist ad campaign about the crying Indian and like, don't be a litter bug, putting the burden on consumers again to not litter, or, you know, chasing arrows on all of their products and saying, no, we're doing our job. We put a little chasing arrow on it. It's recyclable. It's on you for not recycling. Like, they have time and time again put the burden on us consumers without giving us proper information, access, or standardized products so that we could recycle these things.
Well, I guess part of my question was, did they make recycling seem more realistic than it really is?
Yeah. Honestly, I know there's been some investigative journalism on this. I think the answer is yes, but I'm definitely not an expert there. Kind of to your second point, should we throw our hands up and say, this is a broken system, they pushed this, it's not working? I will say there's a number of environmental groups that are kind of leaning that direction right now. I don't think we have an option. We're not going to eliminate plastics from everything overnight, let alone ever, maybe. Like, we are going to have plastics in some way, shape, or form in our marketplace going forward. Hopefully less, all of those caveats. But if we recognize that we are going to continue having plastics in some places, if we just landfill it, we are going to need new plastics constantly. So recycling is the only way that we can get back to a circular economy where we're not going to need virgin plastics. Hopefully, we also get better plastic materials, like alternative plastics, so we can start, supplementing. Instead of just needing to rely on recycling, we also have biodegradable products, we have compostable products, we have all of these other things that can kind of help supplement. But I think recycling is challenging, and it has a lot of failings, and it's going to be hard to fix. But like, to fix this crisis, we need to do hard things, and we can do hard things. We know what we need to do. We just need to like buckle up and do it. So that's my personal opinion on that. On your second part was on biodegradability.
Biodegrading and whether or not that.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about this at length. So I studied particularly an insect whose gut microbiome was capable of breaking down plastics. So really, really cool stuff, very new. We have seen certain fungi, certain bacteria that are capable of breaking down plastics. Generally speaking, they are slow and kind of need like a support system to make that happen. So I don't think we're going to start having like plastics break down in the natural environment, or like where they're not supposed to break down, like anytime soon. I do think there's a lot of really cool opportunities for innovation. So my pitch for my research, when asked like, what would this look like in 15 years, maybe 20 years, who really knows, is we have essentially wastewater treatment plants that like take in waste, turn it into something clean and better. We could have essentially the same. So you have these what's called bioreactors, which is just like a big bacteria soup. You put in a waste product, you get out something else that you want. So that could be you just get out bacteria biomass and you have to like deal with that somehow. Or it could be that you can break down these plastics into something else that's useful. So in my case, these plastics didn't just break back down. So polystyrene, one of the plastics I worked with, didn't break down into styrene. It broke down into these other short chain carbons, like just shorter chain hydrocarbons or other oxygenated short chain polymers. A lot of those are used in the creation of bioplastics, in the creation of pharmaceuticals, and various other things. So you can turn plastics into a carbon 5 length small molecule that you can then extract out and use for something else. So you're still recovering a value there, even if it's not just turning it back into plastics. So there's some element to which that could be interesting. Would also have to be in like a super controlled setting and like, you know, managed and like operated by a true engineer, like a wastewater treatment plant. There's also some people that are looking at like, can we design bottles to be broken down under the right conditions? So like if you make a plastic bottle, could you pre-infuse enzymes such that if it was in a salty, cold environment like the ocean, those enzymes turn on and it starts breaking down? Super duper interesting ideas, very exciting. We don't want to design for failure necessarily. Like we don't want to design with the idea that we're going to get plastics in the ocean, but like it is kind of a good catch-all. So I think there will be interesting things there in the near future. And to your other point, yeah, when you break down plastics, you're going to turn it into carbon dioxide in other products. So, you know, the system in which you're turning it into small molecules is great because then you're not releasing all of the carbon, just some of the carbon. But these bacteria do essentially what we do with food. You know, that's their version of a ham sandwich from Fred Meyer. They're gonna ingest it and respire and release some amount of CO2 and use some of that carbon to grow. So we would be releasing CO2, and this gets into this really vicious cycle of we have a bunch of carbon trapped in plastic right now. Do we want to keep it trapped in plastic? We're running out of space. It's causing environmental impacts. It's disrupting carbon cycles. We don't want to like fully release all of that carbon as well. So a really, really vicious cycle that there's not a right answer to.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Brandon, I'll leave it to you. I know you have family to meet. It's 11:15. We have 2 more questions. Would you like to leave it here or take another question?
I can take 2 questions.
All right. Our next question comes from the humanist with the ironic name, Mr. Al Christians.
Okay, you just got down to it that it's a complicated thing. There was a study recently that said that no modern economy has ever prospered sustainably. That there may be some kind of law or rule at work in that finding. I'm not sure. With respect to the global warming issue, the silver bullet that's conceivable is nuclear fusion, and if we look for a silver bullet to solve this problem, suppose nuclear fusion is an economical source of essentially unlimited electrical power or unlimited energy. Is there a way that you could clean up the environment by using unlimited energy and get all the plastic that you want to get out of the ocean out of it?
Yeah, I love dream scenarios. So in a dream scenario where we have endless clean, sustainable energy, yeah, we can send boats or nets or whatever the heck we want out into the ocean to pick up a bunch of macroplastics. There are people that are starting that work now. I will say, because we do not have clean energy at the moment, it is kind of the general consensus that we probably shouldn't be acting in the ocean to collect the plastics right now. Like it takes just a ton of fuel and things like that, and it just kind of we will need to get to clean up eventually, but I don't think we're there yet. So you could do a lot of that with clean energy, you can, a lot of these new innovative advanced recycling techniques are high temperature, high pressure. So one of the challenges right now with all of those, there are some that are theorized to turn plastics back into plastics, kind of like mechanical recycling. They're all at lab scale right now. And part of that is because they're high temperature, high pressure. And so if you had clean energy and could turn plastics back into plastics that way, without the climate impacts, like that could be really game changing. Yeah. I don't know what we do about microplastics though. Those are out there for a while. So we'll have to continue thinking about that. And then also I think, David, to your point, there is just going to be some natural, like there's already some really rough quantifications of like our plastics breaking down naturally in the environment. And it's like on the scale of 0.00001 metric tons, right? But like, the more microplastics we put out there, the more some bacteria is incentivized to find a niche to break it down, which is not at all an advertisement for putting more microplastics out there. We've definitely got enough for bacteria to find a way. But I do think that there's going to continue being innovation on that front.
And I'll read the last question from Ingrid. It should end with some optimism. What can we learn from other countries in terms of the way they're handling the plastic problem?
Great question. The European Union is doing, they have extended producer responsibility models, so they're doing a pretty great job in terms of recycling collection and access. They are, some parts of that country or some parts of the European Union are pretty space limited, so they actually rely a lot on incineration rather than recycling, which isn't great. But just in terms of like the collection and access, there are so many other countries out there that are leaps and bounds ahead of us in terms of getting recyclables back. There's also lots of countries now that are starting to mandate recycled content in products. So basically saying you can't sell 100% virgin plastic anymore. You have to have at least 20% recycled content in it or something, which is like helping cap how much virgin plastics we need. Trying to think of who else. There's lots of countries that are doing bits and pieces right, but no one has done everything right yet. Like no one's really cracked the code. I will say lots of other countries are farther ahead of us because we have so much cheap fossil fuels that we have not been incentivized to take action. We subsidize fossil fuels on a federal level. So until we kind of get to a level playing field where some of these other business models like reuse and refill or bioplastics or whatever else it may be have a chance on the market, it's going to be really hard to like fully address this problem.
Dr. Brandon, this was very engaging today. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your time with your family and happy holidays.
I will. Thank you all and have a happy holidays as well.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.